Obedience is a concept we can all relate to because it's when we change our behavior due to the request of an authority figure. So you're changing your behavior because someone who you perceive as an authority has told you to do so. Again, some of us like to think that we don't do this, but we do. If a police officer asks to see your driver's license, most of us will follow through with that. There's consequences if we don't. Most of us obey our parents. Most of us obey our teachers, our bosses. We obey a lot. But obedience is something that's been really fascinating in social psychological research, particularly after World War II, because psychologists wanted to see if people here in America could even do some of the horrible things that the Nazi soldiers did. We like to think that we don't have the same kind of evil characteristics that we've seen in history. If you look at our history, we actually do. And unfortunately, all human beings have the capacity to do some unfortunate things due to social influence, and obedience can be very powerful in this. So what Milgram did, Milgram is probably the most famous researcher on obedience, but Milgram wanted to see if the average everyday person, people without mental illness, people who were kind, everyday citizens, would hurt another person simply because an authority figure told them to. So Milgram set up an experiment where two people would come into a room and they were partnered together. One became the teacher and the other became the learner. And they were given some time to learn word pairs. So for example, if I say apple, you're supposed to say red. What would happen then is that Milgram would take the learner and put them in a separate room, and then the teacher would be instructed to say the first part of the word pair and then to wait for their learner's response. If the learner was correct, great. But if the learner was wrong, the researcher would tell the teacher to punish the learner through an electrical shock. So the learners were hooked up to a machine that produced electrical shocks, and every time they missed a question, the voltage on that machine would be increased. So what Milgram is trying to see is if people will harm others just because an authority figure told them to do so. Now, you might think to yourself, that's horrible. I would never shock a stranger because someone told me to. But Milgram found that 65% of the subjects in this original experiment weren't just willing to shock their learners, but they were willing to shock them up to 450 volts. As this was happening, as you went up in 15-volt increments, the learner would begin asking to stop. They would begin screaming. They would begin yelling that their heart was bothering them. Before Milgram did this experiment, he asked all kinds of experts, how many people do you think will go all the way to 450 on the machine? And no one thought that anyone would. Only the sadists, only the smallest percentage of people, they said, would go all the way to 450. But 65% of people went all the way to 450. Now, they looked upset. They clearly looked like they didn't want to be doing it. And all they ever heard from the researcher is that the experiment must continue. So this authority figure was telling them, you must do it. They weren't holding a gun to their head. They could have gotten up and walked away. They could have tried to help this person that's complaining about heart problems. Some did, but 65% did not. So that surprises a lot of folks. It's kind of a controversial study in a few ways, but you'll want to be familiar with what obedience is, how Milgram researched it, and what the results of that experiment were. Remember, no one was actually being shocked. The learners were Confederates, which means they were in on this, they were acting, but the teachers didn't know that. So some people say that's a little unethical because you're making people think they are potentially killing someone just because a researcher is telling them to. But Milgram wanted to see if people were capable of harming others just because an authority figure told them to, just like the Nazi soldiers. So when you think of how powerful obedience in our society is, you can start to see that these problems aren't just limited to certain groups of people. Obedience is something that we all have to be aware of, so we just don't listen to authority figures and lose our own moral compass, our own ideas of what is right and wrong.